This is Call the Psychiatrist, the show where psychiatrists answer your questions. I'm Dr. David Hanley.
And I'm Dr. Abby Snavely.
On today's episode, a listener wants to know if it's possible to get too much therapy.
Say you like me, you better count the ways.
All right, before we get to the question, I need a few seconds for the disclaimer. Listening to this podcast does not mean we have a doctor-patient relationship. Our intention is to educate and entertain you. Nothing we say is intended or recommended as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your own physician or other qualified health professional regarding any medical questions or conditions. All right, well, let's get on to our question. This is from Noah from New York.
Hey, my question is, can someone become over-therapied or get caught in a spiral of therapy and not actually get any better, but maybe even get worse from all their therapy exposure?
All right, so I think there's two things here in this question. I think we should talk about, is it possible to stay in therapy too long? And then maybe the root of Noah's question here is, can therapy actually make you worse?
I think that's fair. I mean, I will come out of the gate saying that I think my general thesis here, if you will, is that if therapy is occurring, right, if a therapeutic process is happening and it's ethical and someone is growing and changing and getting what they want out of therapy, then no, I don't think there is such a thing as too much, which is different than, like you're saying, maybe being in there too long or someone using the therapy or the idea of being in therapy for a different reason. So I think when the too much part comes in, I think it has more to do with the fact that a therapeutic process actually isn't happening.
So if it's good therapy, if it's the right therapy, it's hard to get too much of it.
I think so. I mean, we can talk about different aspects of that, but that's what I think. You know, I have done a lot of training in psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapy. Traditionally, psychoanalysis would have the patient in the therapist's office 4 to 5 times a week over a period of many months, which usually means years. So, you know, just based on my training and experience, the idea of too much therapy, what I might think is too much is probably well outside of what a lot of other people do. And I recognize, that you probably don't practice that way.
Well, I was just thinking, I bet the listener may not even be aware that happens anymore, that level of frequency or that intensity. Mm-hmm. And also, I wouldn't want anybody to come away thinking that was necessary to have an effective therapy, that's just a particular approach.
Right. And that type of frequency is traditional. I mean, I've definitely seen people at that frequency when I think they need it, but I've also used those skills and that orientation for people coming much less often. But I guess the idea of too often or too much, as long as both parties can accommodate the time and money and energy demands on it, like that's sort of a foreign idea to me.
Yeah, as long as progress is being made, as long as you're moving forward.
Oh yeah, fair. Yes. Back to my earlier point, but of course, yes, as long as progress is being made. But again, I mean, so I need to figure out a way to talk about this because I'm like, okay, too much therapy, if it's actually therapy, again, I don't think is a problem. But if I don't know what kind of shorthand I want to use for when people are meeting and a therapeutic process is not happening.
So why do you think that might happen? Why do you think people would stay if they're not growing?
That's a great question. I think there can be a lot of reasons. I think sometimes it could be an excuse. I think sometimes people like to say, you know, I'm in therapy, I'm working on it, as an excuse either to not really change, to not address maybe what's going on with them, to kind of give them an out. I think sometimes it's a way to stay internal or intellectualized, to stay in somebody's mind or in one's mind instead of putting it into action. But especially, you know, if there is a real reluctance to end, it might be that the person doesn't want to lose the therapist because the therapist has been a really important person in their life. Maybe they don't like endings. They don't like saying goodbye. I mean, I think that's a pretty typical experience for people today. Like, we don't do endings well, and that it can be a kind of unimaginable thing. And I guess all of those things are from the patient's perspective, of like why they may stay or protect. Maybe they're also just afraid of being on their own. And that all kind of assumes an ethical, effective therapist in that. But I think there's also some factors from the therapist side.
It sounds like you're implying that a less effective therapist, or maybe a therapist with their own motivations. Do you think that ever happens?
Yeah, I do.
The therapist doesn't want to let them go, whether it's either their own difficulty with termination or maybe financial interests.
I mean, I think there might be. Generally speaking, I actually think there's plenty of patients, and pretty much everybody I know are turning people away and would like to have more capacity. But sure, it might be financial, but I was more thinking about internal, that the therapist likes being depended on, that the therapist likes being the one giving advice. A competent therapist is going to encourage someone to learn how to do things on their own. But if the therapist is being held in regard as the guru or the advice giver, the person to give the blessing, whatever you want to call it, and it's more about the therapist in this position of power and authority, and that feels good to the therapist, they might lose sight of the fact that they're actually trying to foster independence in the patient.
Yeah. So what if we assume that that the therapist is effective and their own needs are in check? So when a person has become overly dependent, how might they improve their agency or contemplate the end more effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, but I think and it's a great point, because I think often dependency occurs and maybe even needs to occur, at least as like a middle phase of therapy. It's fine for someone to feel dependent on the therapist as long as they're moving out of it, right? I mean, always my answer is going to be talk to the therapist about it. And, back to the idea of like too much, some people are going to feel totally dependent in 2 sessions. And some people may not ever want to rely on their therapist after 10 years or something. I mean, right? Like, I mean, sometimes it's obviously overly reductionistic, but sometimes I'm like, my job is just to move people to the middle. Like, you get dependent too fast, let's try to slow that down. You're afraid of relying on other people, like maybe you should rely on me for a while, right? Or see what that's like.
Yeah. It all becomes fodder for the...
Yeah, it's all grist for the mill, man.
Right.
I don't know. I think even on both sides of it, like we're saying, like endings are hard. And I think often people come to therapy with a fantasy, a desire of being cured or being perfect or wanting to have all of their business sorted out by the end. And that's also that's not possible. And often the end is a grief process, or the ending of therapy. It's not just grief of losing the therapist or ending that relationship, but also grieving what wasn't gotten to, what wasn't fixed, like what messy, ugly parts of being human are sticking around, and coming to terms with that this is good enough or good enough for now.
Yeah.
With Noah's question, I maybe have some other ideas about where it comes from, but like you're saying, there is this idea of like, can the therapy actually be harmful, right? Or can too much therapy be harmful? And I'm curious what you think about that.
I do think that there are side effects to therapy, and therapy can be difficult, and you can feel like you take steps backwards, but that's because it's hard. I mean, it's hard for a person to look at themselves in the way that a good therapy is asking you to look at yourself. Like, it's emotionally exhausting, especially in the first 2 sessions before somebody gets used to the process. Although that may continue on for every single session, where people can't go back to work, or they need to go take a nap because they're just so drained.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I do think that people can get so caught up in their head. I think you referenced this, where people can the inaction that comes from it. And what I see sometimes is we've asked somebody to pay so much attention to themselves, their thoughts, their motivations, their feelings, their actions, and they start questioning everything. And then
Mm-hmm.
in that questioning, they lose confidence in themselves or feel like they can't trust themselves. Their minds are now unreliable. I mean, that's a very scary feeling. It's crazy making, and it can be paralyzing because you feel like everything has to be analyzed or overanalyzed. And it's in that process, it's in that little whirlpool that I see people get stuck in, that they're afraid to take action or to
Mm-hmm.
try to make some kind of change. In other words, they get all this insight, all this information, all this observational data, but then it's the putting it into action that becomes the next step, which is another really hard step. And so until you put it into action, as long as you're caught in the vortex, yeah, you feel worse than you did when you first came in.
For sure. Well, and yeah, and to me that would be a problem again if it stopped there, right? If that was the whole purpose. So I know we're not actually arguing here, but I'll push back a little bit. It's like, well, is that the fault of the therapy, or is that why the person needs to be in therapy? Right?
I would say that it's incumbent upon the therapist to make sure the patient understands that process. That
Okay,
yes,
that's
this
fair.
is hard, but as long as we have to push through this. You and your patient have to agree that this is the right approach to take. There's a lot of different kinds of therapies you can do
Sure.
that may not necessarily put you in this state. But I think if Noah is stuck in some sort of whirlpool like this, it may just be that the therapy isn't over yet. That more time and more effort is going to be needed to get to the other side of it.
Right. And I mean, and I want to have empathy for that. Like, it's very dysregulating. It can be very upsetting. But I'm with you. I mean, I think there can be side effects. And I do, if we believe that therapy is powerful, and I do, and has the ability to do good for people or stimulate great growth, then of course there's going to be risks to it. If I'm defining therapy as a good process, can the therapy be harmful? Short term, yes. I would say long term, no. But therapists can definitely be harmful, right? And
Right.
unwinding someone or getting them into a dysregulated place without any way to get re-regulated is obviously dangerous. There's something about titrating the intensity and the pace and the frequency
and the timing. I mean, just making sure that it's the right time to do this kind of work. I see this with patients who may have maybe a history of trauma, and within a short period of time, it's decided that there's going to be an enormous exploration of that trauma without considering the fact that current functioning is not that great. Maybe there's a lot of self-harming going on. There's a lot of hospitalizations. I mean, there's the day-to-day is not going great. And so it might not be time to go open up old wounds and stick your finger in them.
Yeah, like maybe we should work on coping skills or distress tolerance so that when things get more distressing, a person knows what to do or doesn't feel so threatened by that. Absolutely.
Yeah, at least put the fire out before you decide to start monkeying around
with flame.
Yeah, or something. I don't know.
I love a roll loose metaphor. That's my forte, or my fort.
Thank you. I had another anecdote I was going to share.
Please.
That I think illustrates what I'm talking about in terms of this unwinding, is what you called it. This was a patient who had never been in treatment before of any kind. He was sent away to an intensive retreat. It was a 4-day, 8 hours a day. It was group, it was individual therapy. And it seemed to completely dismantle this person's concept of themselves. They were questioning everything about their life.
That sounds horrible.
Yeah, and sent home on a Sunday. There was no follow-up. It was just, there you go. We've cracked you open. We've shown you the error of your ways. The person was a wreck. I mean, they couldn't function at work. Their relationships were worse than they were because everything was called up into question.
And that is harm. Like, that is clear harm. But on one hand, that's too much therapy too fast, but in the bigger picture, it's not enough therapy, right? There was no putting back together. There was no processing. There was no longer process. There was no figuring out how to live your life with these new realizations, right? Because probably part of what was dysregulating is maybe he found out things that were true, but that he didn't know what to do with.
Right. I mean, I always think of it as, the things that we do, even the things that don't serve us well, just the dumb stuff we do, serves a purpose. It's the best that we know how to do.
There's always a payoff.
Right. And so if you're going to try to strip that away from somebody, you better have a really good plan about what will replace it.
Back to that frequency question. Again, I think there's, to your point, there's a lot of ways to do it. But part of the comfort of a high frequency is that you'll be back tomorrow. Like, we still have tomorrow. I'm going to be here tomorrow or whatever the next day is, right? And that some people will say like, oh, if somebody needs to come that often, does that mean they're really crazy? Okay, maybe. But sometimes that much intensity is required both to put enough heat on to unravel something, and then also have the consistency that when it gets intense, to be able to, come back again relatively soon, at least for a chance to put it back together, or at least it doesn't feel as bad to be dysregulated for a day or a weekend rather than, okay, let's talk about your childhood sexual abuse, or I'll get you a follow-up in 6 weeks. Like, what is that for?
I want people to, be interested in therapy if they feel like they need it. And I don't want people to get turned off by this fact that you can still do a lot of great treatment with less frequency. I know I know I said that earlier, but I have to think it's a very small percentage of the population that is able to access that kind of frequency. I mean, there's so many people that can't get a single appointment, much less multiple appointments in a week. And I'm not criticizing the intervention, but I just don't want the message to be that's what therapy looks like, or that, again, that's just one type. And even meeting every 2 weeks, you can still accomplish a tremendous amount. It may not be as fast.
Sure.
But that's okay too. It doesn't have to.
Yeah. And I guess I'm saying this one example because maybe I think that the things on the further ends of the spectrum, just to illustrate a point. But no, absolutely. I'm not recommending that for everyone. And if you think it's distracting or sending the wrong message, I'm happy to cut that out. But I just think in terms of like, you want whatever the number is or the number of days, I think you want somebody to have an amount of discomfort that they can handle, enough discomfort to change and to think about things and work on them, but not so much discomfort that they can't make it until the next session. I get what you're saying. I totally do. And I'm not defensive about it. I thought I was making a good point, but I hear what you're saying. And it could be both. I was worried that it was, again, coming across as this is why I do it. And so if you're not doing it that way, you might not have enough of a holding place. You may not be able to survive it if you're not coming in with that frequency. So that's all. And I want to be clear, like if somebody can get it done, at once a month, then I'm thrilled for them. Like I don't need, I guess I think I know myself well enough, and I do think the demand is high enough. I don't want anybody putting in more time or energy or money into something than they have to, like at all.
Yeah.
But I think it's always worth, reconsidering, is this working for us? How is this feeling? How is the pace feeling? How is a return on investment, which sounds a little too cold, but it's kind of true because it does take a lot out of people. And I don't know if that's a helpful example or not, but sometimes people will be coming once a week or once every other week, and they'll say, I was thinking we need to go less often. Like, what if we go to once a month? And they might be right, but usually or often what will happen is if I reflect on it, I'll say, yeah, I agree that this frequency isn't working. And so one solution is to spread it out more and not feel like you're spinning your wheels, or a different solution might be to try to meet more often and see if we can get some momentum or traction, right? And see if we can turn up the heat a little bit to get at what you want to get to. And it's not because I think one is right or wrong, but probably their intuition that the frequency isn't correct is right. But I think people don't always know that they can come more often.
Yeah, sometimes when I think about frequency, I want there to be enough time elapsed for the person to try to implement something. I mean, there's so much that happens
Sure.
outside of the office. There's the little seeds that get planted, and they may develop in unexpected ways, or maybe sometimes expected ways. But I think the person needs some time in their lives to see what that feels like, so that there's more actionable material.
That totally makes sense to me. I mean, because the whole reason we're doing any of this is to help people in their real lives, right? Which the rest of their lives. I am ultimately invested in people being a better parent or teacher or doctor or person, or better at whatever they want to be, but not a better patient. Like that doesn't have anything to do with anything, right? I mean, again, I want, like, the goal is that they don't need me anymore. I see people who, by traditional measures, are not coming in frequently enough, but I think there's always something therapeutic in the encounter.
And I have people that I would say they got what they wanted out of therapy, but they still like to check in every 9 or 12 months. Sometimes people come back for 4 or 5 sessions once a year or once every 2 years. The door is always open, but I think that's interesting that some people can get to a place, but the relationship is still meaningful to them, and they can still extract some meaning even with very little frequency.
Or they want to update you, right? I mean, that you had an important experience together, and
usually when I'm getting the update, it's not because things are going well. It's more there's a slip of some kind, and they need a little more support.
Right? They aren't coming back to be like, "Oh my God, I forgot about you, but you have this new podcast." Well, and I guess I've been talking about the orthodoxy of analysis, but a couple of the best analysts I know, I mean, one of them, his favorite saying is, people take whatever orbit they want to. Like, they know. I mean, you can make a recommendation, but you don't need to insist on anything. And I even remember when I interviewed for the program, one of the questions was, tell me about a case that you think you made a mistake on, or that you think this training would help you with. And I talked about this guy whom I had seen for a while, and then I pushed something pretty hard therapeutically. And then, and I had been seeing him, once a week for a couple of years. And then after this big push I made, he said, I only want to see you for meds, and I only want to come once or twice a year. And I felt bad, and I felt ashamed, and I still think I, may have made a mistake. And I was like, I lost him. And, this old analyst, her insistence was, no, you haven't lost him. He's still your patient. He still wants to come in once a year. Like, it's not over. He's still getting something out of this. And that was a really interesting perspective shift.
I get your story, but I also have to say that one thing I learned from analysts is that they're just never wrong.
Fair enough.
No matter what you say, and no matter how it's rejected, it's always, the reply is always, they just weren't ready for it.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, this guy is still taking a real wide orbit, and that was probably 7 years ago. So,
yeah.
I suppose, I won't say we'll never know, but we may never know who was right.
Yeah, patients will tell you what they're ready for and what they're not. I mean, and that goes back to, I know I was saying that we just make it sound like we're always right and they're not ready, but sometimes that is true. Sometimes it's, you have a brilliant idea, but the art is how it's delivered, when it's delivered, how often it's delivered, all those things.
And I guess we could say, like, they're not ready, but maybe the actual problem with that kind of statement is that it sounds derogatory towards the patient.
Oh, of course
and it's
it
like,
does.
I don't know, man. Like, but I'm saying, what if we just back up and it's like, yeah, what if they're not ready? Like, so what? They're not ready because they're not ready. What if you're not ready to be the right therapist for them, then, right?
Yeah,
like,
that's never a consideration in.
I'm telling you, man, I'm considering it right now. But yes, I hear you. That's not the consideration, but maybe that's what I would like to get to, is just a more egalitarian, like, acceptance based. People tend to know what they need. And I might introduce the idea of twice a week therapy to them before that they've never heard of. And I don't know, maybe that sows a seed. Maybe they think it's crazy. Maybe they'll always think it's too much. You can introduce an idea, but if somebody rejects it, I don't know. what's the use in blaming them? I guess I get to be right.
Exactly.
I mean,
historically,
I'm right
yeah.
plenty. I win arguments with my children all the time. Actually, not really. They sort of destroy me. Yeah. Go ahead.
I don't know the caller, but I just wonder if maybe the root of the question is having experienced a therapy that is stuck in the middle, like we're talking about, where things are uncomfortable, you feel dysregulated, and rather than leaving the therapy, it actually probably means you need to push on through to the other side.
Yeah, I think that's a good hypothesis. I also, wonder if the caller is getting pushback from family or friends. Sometimes, like you have pointed out, sometimes it's just norms where someone would say, what, you've been in therapy for 3 years, and that seems like way too long to me based on my experience. I have one patient whose dad claims that he was fixed after 3 sessions.
Oh, that's a good job.
And so
good job on your
I know,
part.
right? Like, that's incredible. But he doesn't understand why his child would need to go more often. And then in a different way, like when a person is growing and changing through therapy, that's going to be uncomfortable to the people close to them because they've changed, right? Maybe they have better boundaries, and
people hate
friend
that.
doesn't like that. They hate it. Yeah. And so people
Right.
might be like, I know you say this therapist is awesome, but I'm not totally cool with the changes you're making. And it might be because of stuff like that. It might be because the person is growing or changing faster than them, and maybe a more generous interpretation. I think the analogy is like, if you've been doing the same dance with somebody for so long and then you suddenly change the steps you're doing, it's going to take them a while to learn the new dance. Like they might just be a little behind, or they might need to adapt. But positive growth for a person is not always comfortable for the people around them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Hey, I wanted to maybe just to wrap this up for Noah, and not to steal your thunder, but I think
steal it. It's yours. I'm wrong, Dave. I'm wrong. See?
No, this is, you say this so much. I feel like you should say it, but I think whatever Noah's impasse is, the answer is that he has to talk to his therapist about it.
It is.
And uncovering why he feels stuck or why he feels worse is going to propel the therapy forward, and he'll probably feel better as a result.
Yeah. And it might just even be helpful to hear what his own individual therapist thinks it means to have too much therapy.
Yeah, right. We went over so many different options, and I bet his therapist has a really good idea about why he feels stuck right now.
Right. And there's like a million more, which is the fun part.
All right. Well, I hope this has been helpful. Listeners, you can leave us a question by email or an audio message at our website, callthepsychiatrist.com. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Call the Psychiatrist. And we'd really appreciate it if you'd leave a review on the platform you're using right now to listen to the show. If you could just pick up your phone and put in that review, we would really love it. I promise.
Love it.
Thanks. Take care.
Talladega Nights was on the other day, and it always makes me think of you.
That's a good one.
It is a good one. I mean, you also had talked to me about it. It's not, you don't only remind me of Ricky Bobby. You mostly remind me of that redheaded skinny kid.
I'm going to come at you like a spider monkey.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what it just reminded me of it. Monkey.
I was thinking, because I used to, whenever I did the conversion disorder lecture, I always use that clip from when he stabs himself in the leg.
Oh, I don't think I ever got to see your lecture.
Oh, yeah. That was my go-to, because that would sear into your mind about neurological dysfunction. So
that's right. That's perfect.